Chapter 23. Horrie takes it on the chin. The rebels brought our food from the cookhouse, but Horrie was not allowed his bones until lights out, lest visitors hear the crunching. "Well now," said Sergeant Popa that night, "how are we going to transport Horrie when orders come to move off?" We decided on a pack bag. I lifted Horrie from his hideout, covered him with a towel. Then Dawn and I sneaked away with him out the back of the tent. We hurried away to the vacated camp area where the Ack Regiment had been and put Horrie to the ground. He hardly knew what to do with himself and scampered round and round us in delight. To please him we played chasings, but when he barked in excitement we sat down until he'd worked off his energy. When he came trotting back to us we gave him his bones. Then his training commenced in earnest. I put him in the pack bag on Dawn's shoulders, but for a start left the flap open. Then away we went, tramping round and round the old camp area. I walked close behind Dawn, talking reassuringly to the wog dog, whose wise little head gazed at me from the open pack. Now and again we'd stop, lift Horrie to the ground, and pat him and whisper, "Good little dog, good little Horrie, very smart pup." And he just lapped up this praise. I changed places with Dawn, and away we went again. Every time Horrie moved, Dawn whispered, "Shh, still, still." Apart from the effort of learning what all this meant, Horrie was not comfortable, for his weight in the bottom of the pack tended to make it fold in on him. We did the best we could. After several hours of this practice, we fastened the flap. Horrie was then completely encased in the pack bag. Again we marched around the area. Horrie now remained very quiet, but the tip of his nose appeared where the flap just covered the side of the pack. Gently pushing back his nose, I whispered, "Quiet, good dog, shh." For a start we left him in the closed pack only 5 minutes. Then we'd undo the flap and let him poke his nose out. As a final lesson on the first night, we put the covered pack on the ground, while Dawn and I sat beside it, and every time he moved whispered, "Shh, still, good dog." Thus, night after night, we trained Horrie until he would stay 2 hours in the covered pack, quiet as a sleeping mouse. And now, when we showed him the pack, he would quietly step into it and cuddle down on his own accord. Day by day, for 8 long days, he remained noiselessly down in the deep black hole. As to tent inspection, now, Big Jim asked with a puzzled frown, "What on earth has come over you rebels? Have you reformed?" Yes, we grinned. Big Jim could not understand the uncanny tidiness, the scrupulous accuracy of gear. One glance now, and inspection was over so far as the rebels' tent was concerned. Then came the great order. We were to move out. In 2 days' time. Tomorrow there was to be a trial parade, each man with all gear moving out of camp precisely as he would do for the last time on the following day. This meant a problem to the rebels. We dare not leave Horrie in the hole next day, for every man must move from camp. Every tent would be stripped bare. Under such conditions, tent inspection must discover even a button upon the bare floor. Horrie must attend parade with us, declared Fitz. In his pack. He'll stand up to it all right, said Don confidently. And he did, but we had not allowed for daylight and heat. Horrie had been trained in the dark and cool of night. He now needed all his stout little heart. We moved off with Horrie in the pack on my back, the rebels keeping an eye on the pack from the following ranks. We'd missed out very badly in foresight, for every man's pack was bulging with kit, while mine looked as if it had collapsed, was only half filled. Luck was with us. None of the heads noticed. Horrie was very hot, only moved once, then became instantly still at Don's warning. Shh! After the parade, when back in the tent, I let Horrie out as quickly as possible. He was nearly smothered. We put him back in the hole, and I got down and whispered to the panting pup. He licked my hand to show he trusted us implicitly, as I laid him down on the old heap of clothes and stroked his head. He sighed and dozed off to sleep. We set to work to improve the pack. We cut round holes in it to admit air, camouflaged the holes with netted string, lined the pack with plywood to keep it square and give it the solid appearance of a tightly filled pack. Then we fitted the pack on Don's back. It now looked the part of a well-filled pack. What was just as important, it was much more roomy and comfortable and admitted much more air. We rolled a pair of socks very tightly and fastened them behind the pack. This kept the pack out nearly an inch from Don's back, which did away with considerable heat and also allowed air to flow between Don's back and the pack. We then put Horrie in and were delighted at the improvement. He could really move now, and the slight movement would not be noticeable. We fastened the flap, then fastened the roll of blankets on it, with the tin hat held between the two straps in the center of the pack. We stood back then and saw it would be impossible for anyone to guess there was anything but a man's kit inside the pack. We stepped out into the night and gave it a thorough tryout. It was perfect. When back in the tent, we took Horrie out of the pack, and his pleased expression and tail wagging emphatically assured us it is okay now. As at dawn we must pull down the tents and pack them away, we must quickly find a new hiding place for Horrie. On this last night, we solved the problem with the aid of the canteen sergeant, a good sport. He hid Horrie away in a cupboard of the canteen for the last day, and never breathed a word about it. That night I recovered Horrie, and quietly edged away from the roadway, sleeping well away from the troops, and joining them in the morning with Horrie and the pack as they were crowding into the transport buses en route for Gaza. When there, Horrie had to lie quietly for many hours in that pack before the train arrived. The rebels then shepherded us towards the guard's van, and before the guard knew what was doing, Dawn and I had hopped in and slammed the door. We were determined about it, but presently managed to square the annoyed guard, though he nearly threw a fit when we let Horrie out of the pack, and Horrie immediately tackled the worthy Oriental gentleman. It proved quite a comfortable ride for Horrie during all the long trip through the Sinai Desert back into Egypt. With Horrie again in the pack, we filed out of the train at Kantara on the Suez Canal and marched to a transit camp. The pack was quickly put to the ground and surrounded by the rebels' gear in such a way that Horrie still had air through the string-laced holes. It was fearfully hot. As we ate, I noticed Captain Hindmarsh now and then glance in our direction and laugh. I felt uneasy, but am sure he did not suspect anything. He was always a cheerful O.C. When we moved off, the rebels managed to stick together. We marched to the canal, with Horrie silent as a mouse, to the heavy tramp, tramp, tramp of feet. As I marched on, I knew how the little wog dog would dearly love to be marching at the head of the column. But it simply could not be. At the canal, we boarded punts, crossed the canal, and once again entrained. We had to travel in a crowded carriage, bound for Port Tufik. It must have been misery to Horrie, the tramp of feet, the marching songs, the laughing voices throughout the train journeys, all the sounds of an army on the move. That was sweet music to him, and now, throughout it, all he had to huddle in silence in the depths of a black, suffocatingly hot pack. Dawn fought for a window seat, and we were thus able to place Horrie's pack with the air hole in the back of the pack, facing the open window. Thus, at last, he got a cool breeze. He needed it. If only the rebels could have taken possession of the carriage, we could have let Horrie out of the pack, but we daren't risk it. These noisy boys were not in the know. Night came. The boys stretched out in the best way they could. Silence at last, except for an uneasy snore, the squeak and rattle of the carriage wheels, the dreamy hum of the train. I placed the pack on its flat side so that Horrie could lie down, and poked my fingers through the strings that covered the air hole and stroked his head. He gave a doggy sigh, and then remained quite content. In the small hours we arrived at Port Tufik, and in the bustle of detraining, Dawn carried the pack. We formed up and marched to a transit camp, where the boys simply rolled up on the sand and slept the last few hours to dawn. Just before dawn, I sneaked right away from camp with Horrie, and finding an old trench, let him loose there, waiting until dawn should get the hang of the new camp. Horrie quietly slipped away to do his little business, and then came racing back up. and down the trench to stretch his little legs. I sat there for hours, puzzling and wondering, discarding plan after plan as to how I could get him on the ship. Dawn found me about 9 o'clock. He had managed to locate the rebels, who seized the opportunity to secure a tent to themselves. He then located me, and I carried Horrie under a blanket through the camp to the tent. We took it in turns to watch at the door, while again and again I had to grab Horrie and slip under the blanket as lads came in to gossip. The lads were so restless they could not remain still. At midday, Sergeant Popa came into the tent. We marched to the embarkation point tomorrow morning. He announced. "Hooray!" we shouted. "So we really embark." "Sure thing. But I've heard another whisper. Out with it. You grizzled old oyster. Imshi." "What?" "Yes, the anti-tank regiment has just camped not far away. One of the boys whispered to me that so far they've managed to smuggle Imshi all the way from Syria to Port Tewfik in a truck." We were delighted at this news of Horrie's girlfriend. His little tail would have wagged itself right off could he have seen her again. Regretfully, we decided we dare not risk it. We were almost on the ship now, and it would be heartbreaking to lose the little dog at the last moment. Love must wait. Apart from unwise risks, the greatest problem of all lay just ahead of us: how to get Horrie aboard ship. The rebels sat around in serious conclave. "If there's one slip," said Popa, "it means the end. It will be the most severe inspection of all," declared the Gog. "I've thought out a plan," I said. "Here it is. The troops will be formed up on the wharf in 3 ranks. After open order march, kit bags and packs and gear are placed at the owner's feet. Now, when the inspecting officers draw near us, I'll quietly faint. Feathers and Dawn will break ranks and come to my assistance. But on reaching me, I'll weakly regain my feet with their assistance. Sergeant Popa, noticing the disturbance, will hurry along and advise Corporal Feathers. Help him up the gangway and get him to a cool place. Fitz will then immediately move to my gear and say to Sergeant Popa, 'I'll take his gear aboard.' Sergeant, 'Yes, Popa,' will reply, 'Do that.' Fitz will then pick up the pack containing Horrie and escort me up the gangway. Once aboard, Feathers and Dawn will inquire where I'm to bunk. Meanwhile, I will have recovered sufficiently so that there'll be no need to take me to the hospital bay. We'll just slip below and find a bunk, or a latrine, where I'll wait with Horrie until all the rebels come aboard and sort things out. Now, how's that for an idea?" "Excelsior," they declared admiringly. "You might even think your way out of jail," said Popa grudgingly. "He'll probably have to one of these days," declared Fitz. Under cover of darkness that night, Dawn and Feathers and I took Horrie out on the desert. While he exercised his legs, we sat a long time under the brilliant stars. This was to be our last night in the Middle East. I wonder what the future has in store for us, mused Feathers. Goodness knows, said Dawn. We lapsed into silence, wondering what the future meant for Australia. We were very unhappy. Singapore gone, Java gone, we did not dare to think too much. Next morning the camp was in a bustle. Soon we were on the march, Horrie in the pack on Dawn's shoulders, and I marching behind to cheer Horrie with a whispered word. Feathers and Fitz marched at Dawn's left, Gordy and Gog on my right. That day the sun blazed down upon a desert that radiated suffocating heat. Horrie suffered terribly. He made no movement, uttered no whimper. At halfway we halted for a few minutes. The rebels screened me while I wet my fingers from the water bottle and thrust them into the top of the pack to feel Horrie's famishing little tongue. Good dog, Horrie, I whispered. Good little pup, stick it out. The last mile dragged by in silence, but for the muffled tramp, tramp, tramp. Sweat poured down faces and necks and bared chest brown with dust. I leaned forward and put my ear to the pack. I could hear Horrie panting, but he never moved. He was a little Anzac. The breathless desert sun poured down upon the suffocating pack, but could not break his spirit. He would have died without a whimper. At last, at long last, we marched out on to a wharf. Soon now would end one of the greatest triumphs of endurance that ever a brave dog went through. On the wharf we sat wearily down to wait. I carefully lifted the pack from Dawn's back and placed it with the hole in the back facing a cool breeze from the water. The rebels squatted around while I again thrust wet fingers into Horrie's hot prison. I whispered, "Good dog," and could hear his little stub tail brushing along the bottom of the pack. Towards anchored ships, heavily laden ferries were taking troops. In low voices we were rehearsing the fainting stunt when Sergeant Popa located us, his grin as wide as the funnel of a ship. There's to be no kit inspection on the wharf, he chuckled in a low voice. Not until we board the ship, anyway. This was a relief as great as it was unexpected. It meant I would not have to become an amateur Clark Gable. A ferry came bustling alongside. We crowded aboard, I carrying Horrie in his pack. There was only standing room. I gained the side of the ferry and stood with my back to the water. Thus the pack was out of sight of the crowd and also received the breeze. All hands were eagerly staring across the harbor, wondering which ship was to be our particular transport. Pleased were we when our ferry headed towards a mammoth liner. Excited, too, when we saw the stars and stripes lazily fluttering over the stern, our first glimpse of the United States Navy. She was the first United States ship to carry Australian soldiers in this war. She was now named West Point and was formerly the SS America, built in answer to the Queen Mary. Cheery greetings floated down to us from the Yankee sailors. The rebels crowded round me as we climbed the gangway and into the ship through a big iron doorway in the side. Horrie's lucky star was in the ascendant. There was no word of the dreaded inspection. We were immediately given a ticket and found ourselves in a huge cabin that could accommodate all the rebels and our cobbers, Reg Jenks and Ron Baker, as well. It was really a palatial flat, of all the luck. We shut the door, lifted off our packs, and grinned delightedly at one another. In the bustle and excitement and anxiety, this really seemed too good to be true. Our extraordinarily large, luxurious cabin also had a separate shower room, all to itself. This room was also fitted up to the nth degree as a princess's boudoir, or Horrie's suite. "Just watch this closely," I whispered mysteriously to Reg and Ron, as I carefully undid Horrie's pack. "First, roll up your sleeves," said Don earnestly, "just to show them there's nothing there." I did so, made a few flourishes over the pack, and said, "Hey presto, Sir Knight, arise from the wars," and out popped Horrie. "Well, I'll be blessed," exclaimed the dumbfounded pair. "I don't know about blessed," said Don, "but we'll be damned if we're caught." Horrie was all wags and grins, and about to bark that he was no phantom dog, when a command from me quietened him on the instant. "But I thought he was with the Palestine police," exclaimed Reg. "How on earth did you manage it?" demanded Ron. "It's a long story," I replied. "We must make Horrie secure first. In the meantime, not a whisper about him." "You can count on us," they promised in one voice. Horrie was in a bad way. To feel him was almost like touching a hot water bottle. Don and I gave him a refreshing bath, and he brightened up immensely after Feathers mixed him a cool drink of Horlick's milk. The rebels allotted me the bunk with an air inlet above it, and I placed Horrie on the mattress under the inlet. As the cool, fresh air flowed over him, he seemed to droop wearily, gave a few sighs, and in a moment was fast asleep. "The poor little wog dog is all in," sympathized Gordy. While we stripped for a bath, I quickly told Reg and Ron the story. We were so delighted with our success. So far we would have loved to tell all the boys on the ship, but this could not be, for it would mean the end of Horrie. The secret must never come out until he was safe in Australia. We wondered if the anti-tank regiment was aboard our ship, and if so, whether the men had managed to smuggle Imshi aboard. We would soon find out. It would be wonderful if the doggy romance were to have a happy ending. Chapter 24. The Stowaway. Better work out the plan of campaign now, advised Gordy, before we're called out on duty or parade or goodness knows what. We must keep Horrie hidden below, said Fitz. The lock on the cabin door eliminates a surprise entry. We must always keep that door locked. One man should always remain in the cabin, I suggested, and we need a code knock so that the man inside will know whether it is a rebel or stranger who demands entry. Suggest a knock, said the Gog. How about WD in Morse? Why WD? Because it stands for Wog Dog. WD in Morse is the knock, they agreed. So that, suggested Gordy, if a stranger knocks at the door, the man inside pops Horrie into the bathroom before opening the door. But what if the visit proves to be a surprise cabin inspection, said Dawn, and the inspecting officer wishes to see whether the shower room is clean and tidy. Tell him that someone is using the closet, replied Gordy. What if he insists despite the bloke inside, asked Feathers. That's the danger, I agreed. The word privacy has no connection with a private in the army. Well, what do you suggest? Asked Fitz. My only suggestion is the pack, I answered. That might do, said Gordy, but you must keep this pack always handy, with the gear always neatly stacked on the bunk. Then you could whisk Horrie into the pack. Shh him, and as you buckle the straps, and place the pack in its place with the gear on the bunk. Then yawn as if you'd been asleep when you opened the door. Thus was decided the plan of campaign. Dawn and I remained in the cabin while the boys strolled out to have a look round the ship and fish for news. I patted Horrie gently, but he was dead to the world. He's all in, said Dawn. I would never have thought that a dog could willingly have put up with all that he has. It seems a long time ago now, I replied, since we left Syria. Yes, but with a bit of luck, I think most of his troubles are over. If we can keep him hidden during the voyage, then there'll be only the last hurdle to overcome, smuggling him ashore in Australia. The WD knock came softly at the door. We unlocked it, and in stepped Sergeant Popa. His first glance was toward the Wog Dog. That little pup has more guts for his size than I thought possible, he said. But his troubles are mostly over now. We're not wasting any time. The ship pulls out tonight. No lingering about for days, and no convoy. One thing about the Yanks, they don't mess about. Where are we bound for? I asked. Don't officially know, but I'm pretty sure it's Australia. Just then the rebels knocked and were admitted. Their faces were wreathed in smiles. We're sure going to like old Australia, buddy, Fitz informed us. Everyone felt quite sure, though it was still only guesswork. But next day, when well at sea, we joined an excited crowd around the ship's notice board. It is expected that this ship will arrive at Port Fremantle at 10 a.m. the 26th of March 1942. The news flew through the vessel, and a dense crowd came pouring down to the notice board. There never could have been a happier shipload of soldiers. Glance at their faces, grinned Popa. Ask any one of them to lend you 10 bob, and he'll give you his deferred pay. It was later still, when the rebels were gleefully discussing the news in the sanctuary of the cabin, that Sergeant Popa came in. "I see Corporal Horrie is fit for duty again," he grinned, and patted the wog dog, who now was his old, cheery, tail-wagging self. "Well, boys, here's what's doing. There will be no cabin inspection today. Here are routine orders from tomorrow onwards. The cabins will be inspected about 10 a.m. During inspection, 1 man to each cabin remains below in charge. The remainder must be up on deck and are not allowed to return below again until 12 o'clock. All stay below each morning so as to be near Horrie. I volunteered, and this was agreed to. The captain of this ship is the most popular man in the Red Sea," resumed Popa. "Why is that?" inquired Don. "His nickname explains it," answered Popa. "They call him No Parade Kelly. There will be no parades at all aboard this ship." "You beaut," came the chorus. 3 cheers for No Parade Kelly. "He'll do us." "I'm going to like the Yanks," declared the Gog. Just then a strange knock came at the door, and I snatched up Horrie, while the rebels broke into laughter and song. To a shh, Horrie snuggled quiet as a mouse in his bag. Popa opened the door. Big Jim stepped in. He was so pleased he didn't notice the delay in opening the door. "Well, I suppose you're happy now," he grinned. "How is your cabin?" "Comfortable, but I don't suppose you'd mind if you were parked below in the coal now you're going back to Australia. Great news, isn't it?" "Old stuff," I answered. "How's that?" he demanded. "We knew it way back in Syria." "Oh yeah," he grinned. "Wise guys, eh?" "No, just plain privates," Fitz answered solemnly. "Well, what about a little celebration when we land back in Aussie?" suggested Big Jim. "Right. Let's make it a surprise party," I replied. The rebels instantly guessed what the surprise would be. Big Jim glanced in a puzzled way at their laughing faces. "What's the surprise?" he asked, but they only grinned at one another and winked mysteriously. "How about doing some tricks for us at the party?" Reg asked me. "Right," I replied, "but it will be one trick only, a magic trick especially for Big Jim, on one condition." "And what's that?" asked Big Jim. "That afterwards you will tell no one of the trick." "But what is this mysterious trick?" "Can't tell you now, but it's called Pack Up Your Troubles." I thought Sergeant Popa was going to burst. "Well, I don't know what it is all about," said Big Jim, "but I certainly feel interested." "You'll feel bewitched," declared Popa, "when you see the trick." "I'll look forward to it," smiled Big Jim. When Big Jim returned to the deck, we let Horrie out of the pack. "How would you like to be a little surprise dog, Horrie?" chuckled Popa. "Now you're here. Now you vanish. You've had ample practice anyway." It was quite okay with Horrie. Next morning brought inspection. The rebels had the cabin shining like a new pen. Then they trooped up on deck. I felt quite confident. This would be child's play to Horrie. Stand by for cabin inspection. With a final shh to Horrie, I stood to attention as into the cabin trooped the OC of our unit, the company commander, one of the ship's officers, and a few NCOs thrown in to make up weight. They gave the cabin a pretty good once-over too. They even peered under the bunks. To me, they seemed peeved. They could find nothing to complain about, so they had to troop out. I let them get well clear before I took Horrie out of the pack. "Very good dog, Horrie," I told him, but his expression was lackadaisical. Cabin inspection was puppy stuff to him. The next day passed cheerily until a pressingly serious problem upset us. Horrie had been well trained in the desert, or in Greece, or anywhere at all. He would never dream of making his private arrangements anywhere near our tent or camp. But here he was unable to leave the cabin, and he was fighting against nature. It was the second day before we noticed it. I took him to the shower room and tried to encourage him. I stayed with him many hours, trying to suggest the little sunken pit below the shower. Unknowingly, I was defeating my purpose by remaining with him. "Any luck?" anxiously inquired the rebels, who now were very concerned. "Nothing doing," I replied gloomily. Poor Horrie was now drooping, obviously unhappy and very unwell. Fortunately, I woke up to the fact of his shyness, so put him in the shower room, stepped out, and closed the door after me. I opened it half an hour later, and the dejected pup crawled out, looking guiltily and miserable. "You poor little blighter," I sympathized, "but you are a good dog, really." But he was still very unhappy. It was not until I left the shower running and closed the door after me that he realized he was not going to be scolded. He gazed up with brightening eyes, his tail commenced to wag, and all was well. But several days later came a shock to our happily organized cabin. Sergeant Popa brought the news. "What's the matter?" I asked at his serious face. "A lot," he answered gloomily. "We must act quickly. A mistake has been made. It appears this cabin really belongs to another unit. You are ordered to vacate. Worse still, there is absolutely no hope of getting such another cabin to yourselves now." "'Struth, wouldn't it?" exclaimed Gordy. "Where are we to be placed then?" I asked. "There are bunks empty in the headquarters area," he replied, "but they are only in ones and twos. and he produced a plan showing the cabin numbers and empty berths. We spread out and scouted round in very uneasy mood, lest the fact that Horrie was on the ship might now get around. They were all good coves, we knew, but suddenly to produce the little wog dog after all this time, well, one unguarded word, one slip of the tongue, would mean the end of Horrie. With a quickening of hope, we found that one large cabin contained members of the signal platoon: Bill Arrowsmith, Bill Cody, one of Horrie's especially close cobbers, Sid Jordan, Dar Davis, Gordon Baxter, Bill Martin, Bob Grohl. These men had all known Horrie well. I was certain that no thoughtlessness on their part would betray him. There was one berth vacant in their cabin. Returning to the rebels, I inquired what they'd found. They'd located empty berths here and there, but all agreed it would be best for me to doss in with the signalers. We'll pop into your cabin daily and take it in turns to watch over Horrie, while you take a breather on deck, said the Gog. So we set about the unpopular job of moving our gear. It was stiff luck indeed that we who had stuck together so long should be separated on the very last phase of the campaign, the voyage home. With Horrie in the pack bag and the rebels giving me a hand with my gear, I entered the new cabin. The signalers were there. I locked the door, then solemnly undid the pack, and out popped Horrie on the floor. In amazed silence, they stared at the phantom. It was not until Horrie ran, with wagging tail, to his old friends, that a delighted yell arose. "Shh!" I exclaimed, with upraised hand. They still could hardly believe their eyes. With laughing faces, they crowded round Horrie, who, in his own doggy way, was busy showing how well he remembered each and every one of them. Finally, they demanded the story. For a dog to appear like this when they, one and all, believed he was far away with the Palestine police must be a story worth hearing. It was an appreciative audience, with the little wog dog sitting back, listening to every word, now and then signaling approval by a cute glance at one of the boys, as if to say, "Now, what do you think of that?" They agreed that Horrie was as game as Ned Kelly. They all agreed that we should carry on as before, keep the door locked, use the WD signal, I to remain below each morning for cabin inspection. But they wouldn't hear of the rebels coming along to relieve me for a stroll on deck. Horrie was an honored occupant of their cabin now, and they themselves would take it in turns to relieve me. The air inlet in this cabin was over Jackie Gardner's bunk. "Horrie can sleep on my bunk under the inlet," said Jackie, and I was glad, for we were approaching the line, and the heat in the cabins was already almost unbearable. Horrie had fallen on his feet again. But he had one bad week ahead of him. It was breathlessly hot in the closed cabin. He never complained, but would life his nose to the inlet to get any breath of the hot air. We dare not let him out of the pack until after cabin inspection. Then I would sit him on the tiled floor under the shower and fan him with a towel until he cooled down. But when I stopped fanning, his coat would become hot again. Every half hour I'd wet him, and his tail wag was my reward. After midday, when the boys came filing down to the cabin, there were plenty of willing hands to carry on with the fanning. The West Point was a palatial ship, but had been designed for the Atlantic crossing, and was not at her best in tropical areas. For 6 days, until we'd crossed the line, Horrie suffered considerably, but soon afterwards became his old tail-wagging self. Up on deck, the days were glorious. The Aussies and the Yanks got on famously. The Yanks soon took to the great national pastime, two-up. They were great sports, cheerful winners, good losers. Games, sports, and competitions helped further to cement an already strong friendship. Even the ship's padre brought up a laugh. In his sermon he said that Moses had left his disciples in charge of the food supply, to wit, a quantity of fish very scarce at the time, solemnly warning the disciples not to touch the fish until he returned. Moses went about some particular job, but the appetizing odor of the fish aggravated the disciples. One by one those fish disappeared. When Moses returned, concluded the padre, boy, was he mad. The anti-tank regiment was not on board our ship. We used to wonder whether the men had got Imshi aboard ship, and whether they would manage to smuggle her into Australia. We determined to try and get in touch with them should they land at Fremantle at the same time as ourselves. It would be the end to a perfect romance if we only could bring Horrie and Imshi together again. The day came at last, the great day. Excited shouts, coos, then cheer after cheer rang through the ship. We raced to the deck, and there, slowly but surely, out of the haze, our own dear land was becoming visible. There could be never anything else so good. And then tragedy, and it was tragedy. Word flew round that Hobo was aboard, and they were after Hobo. Hobo was a beautiful cat, C Company's cat, a mascot and a lovely animal. He had been born during the evacuation from Dunkirk, with death raining from sea, air, and land, with thousands of men dying in a sea of sinking ships and drowning men. Later, the Tommies had proudly presented Hobo to C Company. They became greatly attached to that lovely, proud, and intelligent cat. He had accepted their company and had accompanied them through everything, everywhere. He went with them through each campaign by land and sea, in peace and war, and they had been smuggled him aboard. We did not even know. And now, through some tragic oversight, some tiny piece of carelessness, right in sight of Australia, it had become known that Hobo the cat was aboard. The order was that he must be destroyed. C Company refused to give up the cat. Hobo could not be found. The ship slowed down and stopped. Silently, thousands of men gazed towards the dim shores of Australia. The ship would not proceed until the cat was produced. Hobo's friends held out. We wondered if we could hold out so long, if it had been Horrie that was discovered. Anxiously we awaited. Thousands of men were waiting. Not one man even whispered that the C Company lads should hand over their cat. They held out for 12 long hours. Hobo was produced, thrown overboard. The ship gathered way, gained speed. At last we pulled into Fremantle. The wharf was a sea of cheering faces. A car with a charcoal burner caught our eye, the first we had seen. "What is it?" someone yelled. "A traveling bath heater." The good-humored owner put a match in somewhere, and out shot a flame to roars of laughter from the troops. "Let's sail back to the Middle East. It's too risky here," a wag yelled. How clean and fresh the houses on the hill looked, and yes, there was an old-fashioned square, two-storied pub with handkerchiefs fluttering from the balcony. "I'll bet it's called Bayview," laughed someone. Yes, it was Australia, all right. "If the Japs ever land in Australia," said Popa, "they'd better bring a multitude. They'll need them." A dog was trotting up the road. My heart beat fast. Horrie would soon be doing the same, with just a little more luck. Chapter 25. The Aussie Dog. The West Australian boys disembarked, and happy lads they were. Next morning the ship was under way again, bound for Adelaide. Just a few more days, and Horrie, for the first time, would put his little feet upon Australian soil. His eyes, after many days, would again see the open daylight. We were very anxious. We never left Horrie an instant, and kept that door well and truly locked. The tragedy of Hobo weighed heavy upon our minds. During those few hours in Fremantle, by circuitous means, we had tried in vain to hear news of Impshe. Evidently her ship had not yet called in. On that last night aboard, the rebels with Sergeant Popa crowded into the signaler's cabin to make plans for bringing our long-laid schemes to a happy ending. Horrie was so excited he nearly wagged his tail off. "Horrie is quite confident," laughed Feathers. "He's a cert," grinned Gordy. "He'll make history in Australia yet." A dinkum immigrant, smiled Fitz. "He'll pull his weight," growled Popa. "What's a country without a dog, anyway?" We all agreed. "Now then, you nitwits," said Popa, "there's to be no kit inspection on the ship tomorrow morning, so you can hardly make a mess of it at the last moment. However, there may possibly be an inspection on the wharf. I doubt it. The army is too excited at setting foot on Australian shores again. Now, just in case of an inspection on the wharf, what is the plan? The fainting plan, I said. The rebels and SIGs were confident this would succeed, although I would probably be chucked into an ambulance. This would not matter. I felt certain I would be able to hop out with Horrie. The Gog gave me the address of his people in Adelaide. If anything happens and we become separated, he said, take him straight there. He will be safe as a bank with my people until you can claim him. If you like, you can leave him there for good. Good old Gog, but it was my secret hope to leave him with the old folk in Melbourne. Well now, said Feathers seriously, you know how we all feel about Horrie, Jim, but he is more your dog than anyone else's, at least. The little wog dog has adopted you a shade more than anyone else. We can't all have him. He's yours. There's no need to ask. Do you want him for keeps? I do, I said, but I'll make you all a promise. First of all, I promise he'll have the best home in the world. Secondly, I feel confident that someday he may take upon himself a bride, and I only hope she will be Impshe. In either event, I promise you each a puppy. Loud cheers. I'll call my little bloke Horrie's son, declared Don. Each of the rebels quickly thought of a name, but when the signalers claimed a pup, each, I felt, the least bit doubtful. I knew Horrie had the heart of a lion, but whether he could manage a harem, well. Next morning we anchored at Port Adelaide. Big Jim was the officer at the last cabin inspection. Never had cabin been so spick and span, nor so quickly inspected. Horrie was as quiet as a mouse in his pack. Good show, said Big Jim approvingly, and disappeared to inspect the next cabin. Then, lining up in single file, rebels and signalers before and behind me, we shuffled our way along the passageways until we gained the gangway. Horrie was in the pack upon my back. Never did smuggler's heart glow as mine, even though he carried a fortune in diamonds upon his person. All I carried was a little dog. When I reached the gangway, I laughed in noiseless mirth. I wanted to shout for sheer joy. There was no inspection. The troops were filing across the wharf and on to a waiting train. Almost in a dream, I scrambled into a carriage. Rebels and signalers had grabbed a window seat for me. Very soon, from within the pack bag, Horrie was gazing at Australia through a crisscross of string. Happily, we enjoyed the tea and cakes given by a women's welfare league. Then we were moving towards Adelaide. Few knew of our coming in those terribly anxious days, and we were wildly cheered by all who saw us. At Adelaide we were marched to temporary billets at the Adelaide Oval. The rebels came across to Don and me and quietly shepherded us away behind a grandstand to allow Horrie a few precious minutes' freedom. Horrie stepped out of the pack, stood quiet, still a few moments, gazing up at the wonderful sky. his feet upon Aussie land, his little nose sniffing the sweetest air upon earth. Then, with a delighted yelp, he raced away to investigate his first dinkum Australian gum tree. Horrie was acclimatized. Horrie was whisked back into the pack as special trains came to take us to Burnside Camp. A pleasant Australian woman holding a bunch of papers approached Don and me. "Billets for two," she smiled. "Come along." With a good luck from the rebels, we followed her. She took us to a pretty little house. We waited inside the gate until she knocked at the door. "What if they don't like dogs?" whispered Don. "We must chance it," I whispered, "but I think everyone likes a dog." "Would you come in, please?" called our escort. "This is Private Gill, and this is Private Moody," she said to a decidedly pretty young woman, Miss Trezona. We smiled our best and were shown into a clean little room. "I hope you will be quite at home here," she said anxiously. "It's great," said Don. "It will do me." "Me too," I murmured. "Unpack your things and then join me in a cup of tea," she smiled. As the door closed behind her, Don said quietly, "She seems a real good sort." "Yes," I answered, "but we won't produce Horrie until we are sure." Presently she called us to the kitchen. "I hope you don't mind having tea with me here," she said. We assuredly did not mind. It was a very pleasant little kitchen. We got along so famously that at last I said with an anxious grin, "Are you fond of dogs?" "I adore them." "Excuse us," said Don, and as we jumped up together and foolishly collided in the doorway, I can still see the surprised look on her face, more so when we reappeared, wreathed in grins, carrying a weather-stained pack bag. I quickly opened the flap, and a little white, inquiring head poked out. Two large brown eyes gazed hopefully up at our hostess. "The dear little war dog," she exclaimed, and we knew Horrie had captured yet another heart. When Mr. Trezona came home that evening, we told them some of Horrie's adventures. The party that sat down to the evening meal was Ted and Mary, Don and Jim, and Horrie. The little wog dog was going to love Australia, and Australians were going to love him. Next day, when Don and I met the rebels on the parade ground, our broad grins told them the news. "He's right as the bank," I added, taking possession of the place. "I managed to get a wire home to Dad in Melbourne too." Horrie and I arrived in Australia. The next few days were joyful ones for the troops so long on foreign soil. The Adelaide folk did all they could for us, while we were so happy to be in Australia again, that the hours just melted by. Our unit was to be entertained at the Burnside Town Hall, and Mary suggested we invite the rebels home afterwards for a surprise party. This was just the very thing. In delight, we arranged the surprise we had promised Big Jim. After that very merry dance, the rebels gathered at the Trezona home and filled the place with noise and laughter. Here we were, with the exception of good old Murchie, all united again in an Australian home. The laughter and chatter were interrupted by Fitz standing up and calling, "Attention everyone please. The prime object of our happy meeting tonight is to present to you all, and especially to Big Jim, the world's greatest magician." And he bowed to me. I solemnly reciprocated. "Also," proceeded Fitz, "introducing to you the magician's famous assistant, Dot and Dash," and he waved towards Don and me. Solemnly we acknowledged the hand claps. "The trick you are about to witness," proceeded Fitz, "has never been performed before, and never will be again. To achieve the phenomenon about to be witnessed, Dot and Dash have blended the elusive magic of the mysterious East with the skill of the cultivated West, backed up by the initiative and determination of our own sunny South. Time is passing. The moving finger writes on. The curtain rises upon the past to bring to the present the magic you now will see." And Fitz sat down amid thunderous clapping. Don and I rose again. "Take the bow." I held up my hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, particularly our guest, Big Jim, in whose honor this miracle is about to be performed, I first ask you in all seriousness to swear you will not say one word of what you are about to witness, not until at least 48 hours from now. Do you all swear?" They swore unanimously. "Very well." Silence. Dawn vanished. In a now expectant silence he reappeared, reverently carrying an object covered with a white sheet. Carefully placing it in the center of the carpet, he made a few passes over it, then stood silently. I bent over the sheet and made mystic passes, murmuring, "Anti-Brachazar, anti-Brachazar," then, in a sepulchral voice, said, "I now ask our friendly enemy officer, Big Jim, to step forward and remove the covering, then to open that which waits underneath." Big Jim was laughingly thrust forward. Somewhat doubtfully he gazed down at the sheet. "I'll be the goat," he laughed. "I'll get even with you on parade afterwards." Slowly he pulled off the sheet. A pack bag was underneath. With a puzzled smile he undid the flap, opened it. For a second he stared, then "Horrie," he shouted. Well, I'm blessed. And Horrie was barking up at him in a frenzy of tail-wagging pandemonium as Big Jim lifted up the excited pup. The girls crowded around to pet him. The pup, I mean. Big Jim would have appreciated it much more. Horrie passed me a scornful look, trying to make me a sissy, he seemed to say. When Big Jim called for silence, he simply said, "Friends, words cannot convey what I mean when I say this has been one of the very pleasant surprises of my life. You could only understand had you been over there and known how this game, Little Wog Dog, entered into all our lives. To thus meet him again on dear Australian soil, well. Next day, the rebels got a whisper about Impshe. The rumor made us feel happy. She was discovered, so the rumor said. Only one day before the boat reached Fremantle, she disappeared. That same day I was en route from Melbourne, in the quick movement of troops to their hometowns, and in the soon-to-be quick movements to the danger now hammering at our very own north. Troops lost touch with one another. And to this day, we are not really certain as to Imshi's fate. It was the hardest of luck that her friends should get her to within one day's sail of Australia and then be forced to destroy her. But we still believe she may be happily in Australia. Her friends, when she was discovered, may have worked already and got her ashore after all. Anyway, if Imshi's owner reads these lines, and if Imshi is in Australia, he will now know there is a little wog dog called Horrie, very anxious to meet his lady love again. Let us bring them together again, for the sake of the old romance. There is not much more to tell. I got Horrie safely home to Melbourne, where he is very happy with the old dad, a better man than I. We, the rebels, and the signallers, and the battalion in our wanderings since have missed his cheery company very much, but we all look forward to the reunion, the great reunion when the Wog Dog and Murchie and we all meet again after the war. Until then, the little Wog Dog sends greetings and wishes for a safe return to his very many friends. The little outcast of the desert, Corporal Horrie of Egypt, Greece, Crete, Palestine, Syria, is a dinkum little Aussie dog. April 1944. Much water has flowed under the bridge since our great party. Since those fearful days, we and our great allies have driven back the enemy from Australian shores. And our dear country breathes again. There is much, alas, very much more to do yet, but how immeasurably stronger we are to do it than we were in those fateful days, when the Wog Dog first set foot upon Australia. Since then we have been through the hell of New Guinea. But what, I am in a hurry to tell you all of this. Only a few days ago, Don and I, back from New Guinea, on leave in Melbourne, heard a shout across the street. He was one of the boys. He had just been landed after a long period of guerrilla fighting in the East Indies. He dare tell us but very little, as you can readily understand, but he told us this great news. Murchie is still boxing on. Murchie is safe, fighting as we knew he would, to the last. He is away up in the mountains and chief of half a dozen villages. He has his own little commando. He is still waging his private war, waging his private war against the Jap. He will hold out, will Murchie. Soon we will meet Murchie again. Hurrah! Epitaph. Well, Horrie, little fellow, your reward was death. You who deserved a nation's plaudits, sleep in peace. Among Australia's war heroes, we shall remember you. Under quarantine regulations, Horrie was destroyed on the 12th of March, 1945.